And we are now being recorded. Just for the sake of what we're wanting to do here, John Calhoun and Norm Shoemaker and I run Benefiel. We're all graduates of Pasadena College and are some of the older members of the Point Loma community at this point that have memories of some of the earlier years of the school and some of the people. And so we thought it might be a good idea to talk a little bit about some of those people, and actually some of those people have their names on some of the buildings. So when our students are wandering around campus and they go into, Wiley, they don't know what Wiley is, but we do. And we think that maybe it would be helpful if people on campus knew who these people were. I think part of the way I think about this is that how did we get here? Point Loma didn't just happen out on the bluff here. There were people who had a vision, people who sacrificed. Churches paid budgets every year. For the most part, it was over $2 million a year that the churches raised money and sent in. In fact, quite a bit more than that. It's a little less than that right now, but it's still about $1.4 million a year that the churches raise and send to Point Loma. And there were people who had a vision. Phineas Brzee, actually, it was 6 women who prayed and convinced him that there should be a school. And those 6 rocks out in front of the prayer chapel symbolize those 6 women whose names we've forgotten, but whose prayers persist. And there were times when the school was in so much trouble that there were presidents who mortgaged their home to keep it afloat, or an early theologian who was actually one of the earliest female theologians in the country and in the UK, Olive Winchester, who had some money, and so she paid for faculty salaries to keep it afloat. And at one time in the late 40s, things were so tough at Pasadena College that there wasn't enough food. There wasn't enough money to provide food for the students. So Central California, the churches up there formed a caravan where they brought down food for the cafeteria. So people have had sacrifice. Those are just a few examples. A lot of the buildings on campus then are named for these different people. Some of the buildings are named after donors, which of course you would expect. Some of those we inherited from the previous owners of the campus, Cal Western. But a lot of them are named after some of these men and women, mostly men, who have sacrificed and given leadership to the university over the years. So we're going to begin with, actually, part of the history of all of this is the school chapter, Isaiah 62. And John's going to talk to us just a little bit about that chapter and why it's so significant to Point Loma National University.
Okay. A memorial to this chapter that sits on campus that students walk by every day and probably have no clue it's there. It's that bronze, looks like a piece of metal, like a big door that somebody dropped on the lawn. But if one goes close to it, they'll see the words of the chapter of Isaiah 62 there, which was, it's on the south side of Cooper Fine Arts Building, between that on the lawn there and between that and the Greek. And people walk by it and don't know it's there. But it really signifies some of the heritage that is key to this campus. And Dr. Brzee was president in those days, early days, when it was about to fold. And that was more than one time. But one of those times, there was just no money and we were just about to close up. And he was really under a heavy burden about it. And he read this chapter, which was intended for Israel's recovery to Jerusalem after they had been taken slaves over to Babylon. And they finally got to come back because Cyrus, king of Persia, let them come back. But it was just their city was ruined and the temple was ruined. And they came back to that, and he wrote, and this is out of that passage or that period of time where they were terribly discouraged like he was discouraged, and it was a promise. Obviously can't read the whole chapter for time's sake, but there at verse 4 it says, "You shall no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate, but you shall be called, my delight is in her, and your land married, for the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married." It was a promise that he took that was meant for the people of God centuries and centuries ago. And he took it to mean that it's applying to the work that was going on with this school that we are not a part of. And then it is a way of saying, there's a lot of promise saying you're going to be looked upon as something great one day. People are going to notice you, and it's not because you're great, because God is great. And then that sculpture that I just referred to is verse 10. Go through. I heard Norm preach this one time, by the way. Norm should be talking about this. Go through the gates, prepare the way for the people, build up the highway, clear it of the stones, lift up an ensign over the peoples. It was like, okay, people, you're in this broke down city, but get ready for people to come in and make way and do your job. And God's going to do something great here, and you're going to be prosperous. But the real final word of that is, the last verse is, they shall be called the holy people, the redeemed of the Lord, and you shall be called sought out and a city not forsaken. So Brzee had this great vision that not only would it be world in the eyes of the world something to look at, but in the eyes of God, because the people that occupy this place will be a holy people. All right, so the story of even buying that sculpture is another matter, but it's a way to remember a great promise. And so I think about that when he was there, we were on a little tiny piece of land that's on Melrose Avenue, where Paramount Studios are right now in Los Angeles, and it was a run-down place. And he can't imagine we'd be here at Point Loma looking at the ocean with one of the most sought-after pieces of property that could be named in anywhere. And but it's not just about that part of it. It's about the core of the people that God promised that we would be. So that when you walk by, sometimes these things are a way to remember where we started and why we started and who paid for what we got here. So that's probably a little seed thought. There's a whole lot more that could be said. But Brzee was a man of great vision and a great promise, and he was used of God, and he pastored a church in Los Angeles that started the Church of the Nazarene worldwide, and eventually Ron Benefiel here was a successor as a pastor there sometime back, and Dana knows all about that. Okay, that's probably enough. I took too long. Thank you.
Not at all, John. That was great. Thank you. So just the Isaiah 62 passage chapter is the theme chapter for the university. And every year at the baccalaureate service, the president or whoever was appointed preached from that chapter for decades. That doesn't happen anymore, but that happened for years and years and years out of Isaiah 62. There are so many buildings to mention. We can't talk about all of them, but I do want to mention just a few that we're not going to spend a lot of time with. Three of them are former presidents. Nease, Finch, and Draper were all presidents at Pasadena College, now Point Loma Nazarene University. Orville Nease in the 40s. He later became a general superintendent in the Church of the Nazarene. Finch, O.J. Finch, in the early 60s. And then Draper in the late 70s. And so these three I want to mention were presidents of Pasadena Point Loma. Also, Smee was a district superintendent when there were only two districts in the state of California, for everything from Bakersfield clear up to the Oregon border, and was an influential leader. Actually, his granddaughter, Cheryl Smee, was the director of alumni affairs here for, my goodness, must have been at least 20 years. And then I want to mention also Wes Mirris Hall. So Mirris Hall, where the president and Kerry's office are, Wes Mirris was an attorney who handled all of the affairs for Pasadena College. And as we were making the move from Pasadena to Point Loma, and he knew everything that needed to happen legally, he died in a plane crash. And all of that knowledge was lost. And actually, Ross Irwin, who happens to be my father-in-law, Ross Irwin picked all of that up and then became the attorney for the university for decades after that. But Wes Mirris was a very committed layperson that really helped to make things happen, but his untimely death was really difficult for the university. So I wanted to mention those. Now we do have about 8 that, let me think, yes, 8 that we're going to talk about. And we've got 3 or 4 minutes to talk about each of these. Thanks to Kelly Klassen, our very capable and faithful administrative assistant, who is a star actually in the CPL. She was able to put together some slides and actually took some of the pictures herself of some of the buildings we're going to talk about. So the first one is, we're going to talk briefly about the Brzee Alumni House. We've already talked about Phineas Brzee. His, let me just mention this part. He was actually not himself highly educated, but he had a real commitment to education. He had been involved in Simpson College back in Iowa. And then when he came out to Los Angeles as a presiding elder for Los Angeles in the United Methodist Church, at that point, the Methodist Church, he was on the Board of Trustees at University of Southern California, where the co-founder of the Church of the Nazarene was the president. And so he was actively involved in education. He wasn't really that much in favor of starting his school, but it were these 6 women who prayed that finally convinced him. And in 1902, he founded, but at that point, it actually had previous names, Deeds Pacific Bible College, and I forget what the first name was, but it went through his number of names, but he founded what became Point Loma Nazarene University. His name is not only on the Brzee Alumni House, but also in the library. I believe the system that you use to look for books is, I think, is still called the Phineas, after Phineas Brzee. So John and Norm, things that you'd add about Brzee and his legacy?
Please, Norm, go ahead. I already talked.
I would just add his commitment to the ministry, to the lost, the least, the broken, deep desire to have a healing, compassionate ministry in Los Angeles. And his discomfort in being in very prominent today we would say United Methodist churches, where people were very well dressed and their lifestyles reflected a certain amount of success, that he felt was ultimately alienating to marginal people that should feel comfortable in worship. And so I think this vision that he had to reach out to common people was a part of his legacy, in my judgment.
Norm, I think it's really important that Point Loma Nazarene University, what's the Nazarene in Point Loma Nazarene University, is the Church of the Nazarene. And not only the denomination, but the school itself was part of this commitment, this new denomination that began back in 1895 to preach the gospel, especially to proclaim holiness throughout the land, but with a special calling to the poor, to those in need. And that's part of our heritage at Point Loma Nazarene University, is to be a school that welcomes those who are in need. Mm-hmm. John, anything to add?
Much more. He was an abolitionist, by the way, when he was in New York before the Civil War. His mentor was the preacher at Abraham Lincoln's funeral. So there's a lot to talk about him.
Much, much more. Let's go on to the next. Wiley. H. Orton Wiley, H-O-W, H. Orton Wiley, was theologian and actually was president of Pasadena College clear back in the 20s when he was in his 20s. He became president and then actually had 2 other terms. He was president at Pasadena College 3 different times. Norm, John?
Well, I think I'm correct in this, that it was actually on Dr. Brazie's kind of final hours that he said to Dr. Wiley, please stand by the college. And so I think Wiley was a presence in those early days of establishing Pasadena College, now Point Loma, through his 3 terms of service to the university as president during some very challenging, formative days. I think of him as probably the foremost theologian, educator in the Church of the Nazarene in the 20th century.
That's true. He was got his doctorate up at Berkeley when at the seminary, university. Don't remember the name of the seminary, but it's still there in some form now.
Theology,
yeah, Pacific School of Theology. Yeah, he was a first scholar among the group of the Holiness movement, and that gave birth to the movement that we were at that time. And he had some tough times because he got fired for once from being president because it was a power struggle, and he was an exiled president up at Northwest Nazarene during those days, and then everybody said we should have him back, so he came back. That's why he was there twice. And he
3 times, actually.
yes, so he was immensely a shaper of the Church of the Nazarene doctrines and theology, but also obviously the school, and many people came under him that went on to do great things.
I'll just add, related to doctrine, I have heard, and I don't know the accuracy of this, that he almost personally crafted the language for the Nazarene article of faith on the scriptures, and that tying inerrancy to all things necessary to our salvation is a critical part of the doctrinal history of the church, and I think it's a gift to us actually to this day.
So it wouldn't be too much to say that actually with Wiley as president, and following that, actually, one of the presidents we're not mentioning is Purkhiser, that these were top theologians, not only in the Church of Nazarene, but in the larger American holiness movement. And so that Pasadena College was not only a place of education, but it was a center of theological research and writing. It was a theological center certainly for the church and beyond.
Yeah.
Let's look at the
here quickly. On the platform or the stoa doa of the Greek amphitheater at every commencement, there are 3 large chairs that are wood carved with a kind of a maroon upholstery. And one of them, the center chair, is much larger than the 2 on either side. And they're always present at Point Loma's commencement, but they actually came from the Pasadena College campus and during Wiley's presidency. For that reason, during his final years, that center chair was always reserved for him. And out of respect for him, nobody would sit in that chair. And it was always empty in chapel unless Wiley was present for that particular chapel. And he was alive still when my student days, and I can still see him sitting in that huge, large center chair, but he was a very diminutive, small person. And I just have this visual image of him kind of folded into this massive wooden chair in the center of the chapel.
Thank you, Norm. At some universities, especially smaller Christian teaching universities, often there will be a professor who emerges as sort of the one who embodies the character of the place. And there have been different ones in the history of Pasadena Point Loma, but one who stands out as sort of symbolic of the place is Culbertson. We're going to go to Culbertson, the picture of Culbertson Hall here. And so Culbertson was a psychology professor, but one whose personal influence was way more than just what happened in the classroom. Norm, John, thoughts on Culbertson?
Well, he was a psychology professor, but his PhD was in history. I don't think anybody would know that. And by the way, Dr. Gresham was a history teacher, but his PhD was in psychology. I'm pretty sure I'm right on that. Dr. Culbertson was this landmark personality who was a great intellectual person, but had a great heart for God. And he quoted endlessly some reading that said, "I will hew great windows for my soul." If anybody would remember him, that I would have to, I didn't bother to look that poem up for this time here, but he kept quoting that many, many, many times. And he had great advice, and he gave me personal advice when I was seeking God's will in my life. And you know, all the professors were wide open. You could go to any of them anytime. And I said, I'm just really not clear on what to do. And he said, well, typically God just works with the gifts he's given you, and you just look for opportunities to serve him and place your heart and gifts into a place that is opportunity. So is that good enough to start out? That was a very practical person. That's probably a little bit more than you've wanted to hear from me about that.
That's great.
Yeah.
Norm?
I think in the emerging years of Dr. Culbertson's involvement at Pasadena College, people having an earned doctorate was still rather unique and put them in a kind of a position of influence. And I feel that was certainly true for Culbertson. I took courses from him as a psychology major, and a little personal memory in the classroom. If people were talking like at the back of the class in a conversation, his approach was just to stop speaking. And he didn't call out these people. He would just stop and stare with a kind of a stink eye at these people, which meant everybody else in the class who was paying attention turned in the direction of those students. And they were so engaged for a little while that they didn't realize that he had stopped lecturing. And then all of a sudden it would dawn on them that there was total silence in the classroom, and they would look up and see everybody staring at them. And that was sobering enough that he pretty well had control of the classroom.
You know, I think I have done that. I wonder if maybe that I picked that up in his classroom where I was the one that, well, moving on here. So anything else to add on Culbertson? Moving on, the next two are presidents that we especially wanted to talk about. Not that all of the presidents certainly have made a mark on the institution, but two that we wanted to talk about in particular. One was Shelburne Brown. And Shelburne Brown was the president who helped to lead us. Well, he was the one, sort of the Moses who led us through the change from Egypt into the Promised Land, moving from Pasadena to San Diego. And it was a bold move and a controversial move. He also, not too long after the move was made, he developed cancer, and it made him go blind, and then he eventually died in office, but was seen as a great president, a leader who led us through what was the biggest change in the history of the institution. John, Norm?
Oh yeah, yeah. We could talk so much about each one of these. He especially, though, in my mind, I think of us today and read Deuteronomy. I think Moses telling the people when they're about to cross into the land, you will eat from fields you did not plant. You will drink from wells you did not dig. And that's us now. I mean, he sacrificed so much to have this vision of moving a whole campus with all the faculty, selling their houses and moving their families and coming to San Diego. And not only that, he had just raised a bundle of money to build a new library on the little campus we had in Pasadena, just 16 acres. And everybody was exhausted from that fundraiser. And then he comes up with this, seeing the opportunity to come here before it was known that it was for sale. And he jumped on it, and there was not enough money to do it at all. But anyway, that's the beginning of this story, and we still live with the fruit of that labor of love he gave. That's probably enough for me. Norm knew him very well because he grew up right there and went to church with him.
Yeah, I had his two sons in the youth group when I was the youth pastor in Pasadena, and was in their home quite often. I do know that among his peers, even when he was a student at Pasadena College, he was a real center of influence. He was a very naturally gifted leader, and actually a really fine athlete, and was a scratch level golfer and a pilot and excellent skier. And he was a person who was striking in a sense, a lot of personal charisma. And so it wasn't surprising that he would have a defining legacy as a president. But the idea of moving a college from Pasadena to San Diego, just moving the books of a library, is hard to imagine task. But I think that the risk that he embraced in making this move was significant, in the fact that for a while they couldn't sell the Pasadena campus, and they actually owned and were financially responsible for both properties simultaneously. And they were at risk, actually, of the banks shutting them down. So I know family members felt like it was the stress of that season that might have even contributed to his early death.
Thank you. And this moves on to from Brown to Bond. And Jim Bond was president through much of the 90s, most of the 90s actually, and had originally come to Pasadena College in the middle 50s, where he was a basketball player, in fact, an All-American basketball player, and led Pasadena College's team to some of our better years there. Later then, after pastoring a number of years, he came back and was an administrative assistant to the previous president, Draper, and then was elected president at Point Loma Nazarene University. Served very capably and would have continued to serve, except then he was elected general superintendent in the Church of the Nazarene. So there's so much to talk about when we're talking about Jim Bond. John, Norm?
Well, yes, there is. He's from Texas. I'm from Texas. And he was he had 65 scholarship offers to play basketball of universities all over America. My father-in-law was the district superintendent then, and those days, and that's long before he was my father-in-law. He's the one who encouraged him to come out to Pasadena College. and to play basketball out here. And so instead of going to major universities, he came to Pasadena College to play basketball. And on his way out of packing up his car, he and his brother were driving to come out here, and a highway patrolman stopped him and said, I was expecting you to come by because the coach from Texas A&M basketball called the governor and asked me to stop you and see if there's any chance you would not leave Texas. and you know, so we could go on and on and on about it, but he was first round draft choice to the Lakers when they were in Minneapolis. And he took all of that away. I mean, he just passed that off in order to follow his call to be a minister. And everybody knows so many great things about him, but integrity, it always comes first in my mind. That man was a transparent, authentic human being who loved God and loved the church.
John, just along that line, the integrity and his character, his moniker was Gentleman Jim. Everybody knew him as Gentleman Jim. Norm?
That's really true. And every time he would enter a room, you never had to wonder which president was going to show up, because always Gentleman Jim Bond walked into the room with that genuine humility, spirit that was so gracious and kind, even on the basketball court, so that a sports writer at Pasadena Star News labeled him Gentleman Jim Bond. And that moniker stayed with him for many, many years. I think his integrity and deep heart for God was reflected in his presidency by a very deep commitment to embodying the mission of the university. And in my mind, that was reflected first and foremost in the way he worked with the faculty and how he brought new faculty onto the campus, and was passionate about people who embodied the mission of the university. And of course, more personally, his commitment to the mission was reflected in starting the Office of Spiritual Development and inviting me to come down in the fall of 1987 to start this new thing that nobody really had any idea what it might look like, because it wasn't a model that existed in Christian universities at the time. And he felt like that just having chapel 3 days a week and a chaplain was not going to be adequate to realize his vision for the spiritual formation of students. And so when I came down in 1987, there was no staff there. They provided me with an office, and we just sort of started a great idea and trying to bring it into reality. And that first year started Time Out on Wednesday nights and the Love Works program and some discipleship groups that met on the campus. But it was kind of the emerging beginning of this vision that Jim had for the spiritual development of students on the campus.
Yeah, I think both his commitment to education and his commitment to the mission, especially with regard to the spiritual development of students and his passion. I can remember him preaching a number of times, and the passion that he had for the school, that there would be a revival that would sweep across the campus. But his commitment to education, he didn't have an earned doctorate when he was elected president, but he pursued a doctorate as the president. He took time and then was able to get his doctoral degree after he was elected president. Moving on, we want to talk about not only those who have been presidents or church leaders, but also professors like Culbertson, who have given themselves to the life of the school. We want to mention two more here. One is Chester Krill. And Chester Krill is, we have the Krill Performing Arts Auditorium, of course, in Cooper. And Chester Krill was the choir director, the a cappella choir director for many years, and was sort of symbolic of, along with maybe Hagan, symbolic of the music department at Pasadena College. John, Norm?
Yes, I happened to be a music major at that time, and so I knew him pretty well. And his musicality was certainly strong, but he was not a temperamental musician. I hate to label people, but you know there's plenty of labels around. But he had this common sense thing about him, even though he could function professionally without questions, and he certainly knew what he was doing. But he had a real leadership ability and a people sense in terms of choosing faculty and working with students. So, we got plenty of funny stories traveling with him with a concert choir, going up to Portland to the General Assembly in 1964, and things that how he had to put up with a lot of pranks, dealt with a lot of things like that. He had a real sense of humor, but he was easygoing and he didn't take himself seriously, but he knew how to show up when he needed to mean business, and he could mean business without being a tyrant. And so, and he must have been here 40 years. I don't really know. Norm would maybe even know better, perhaps. But he came from Southern Nazarene University, then called Bethany Peniel College, because he wasn't strict enough on the students for those people. So he found a new place out here in Pasadena, and he was a great fit. That's I hate to even pretend I know, because Norm grew up in Pasadena with him very, very much. So thank you, Norm, for your kindness and generosity for letting me talk when you should be the one talking.
Well, I wasn't a music major on the campus, but I did grow up in Brazil Avenue, Church of the Nazarene, a block away from the campus. And when Chet and Alice Krill came out from Bethany in 1947, he became the minister of music at the church. And I was a boy of 8 years of age, and immediately my mother thought I should take piano lessons from Alice. And so I began to have weekly lessons in their home from the age of 8 on, and then was invited in 1962 to be the full-time youth pastor at the church, which kind of put me on the ministry team that included Chet Krill. You talk about Chet Krill, you can't really talk about him without talking about his wife, Alice, who was a very talented, profound person in her own right. And in the music ministry there at Brazil Avenue, they were a team, really hand in glove together. She did a lot of the organizing, a lot of the arranging of the choral music. Chet was more the upfront person, but she was the organist. In fact, they purchased and installed the organ in Brown Chapel, the organ that's in the Krill Performance Hall, the organ that's actually in the Ellipse Chapel at First Church. All of those organs were donated by the Krills. And what I also recall with vivid memories is the Christmas production that they produced every Christmas for years in Pasadena, called The Tidings of Joy. And it was performed over about 9 days, and standing room only audiences. And it was quite a thing in Pasadena at that time. It was almost like an operatic Christmas production, and full staging, costumes. The principal performers all were singers, and a lot of the script and the music was original. So it was quite an important contribution to the civic life at Christmas of Pasadena.
Thank you. Moving on another prof, in this case, coach, that has had a long standing major impact on the university is Carol Land, who actually is still an employee at Point Loma Nazarene University, just celebrating 60 years. That's 60 years of service to the university. He's most known for most of those years as the baseball coach. My brother Randy was on the team back in that would have been in the 70s, when they had a great team with several players that went on to be drafted and some that played in the pros. But Carol Land's spirit and his expertise and reputation elevated him into back then to in the NAIA to positions of leadership there, and highly respected by players. He's one of those on our list. He and Jim Bond are the two on our list who are still with us today. Carol Land, 60 years at Point Loma Nazarene University. Norm, John, anything to add?
Go ahead, Norm.
I'll just add that, well, he was a classmate of mine at Pasadena College, was a little bit older. He had been in the Marines and then married his wife, and actually became the baseball coach right out of his life as a student, and stayed with the university the entire time, as you mentioned. But one of the contributions that I attribute to Carol Land was developing a philosophy in the athletic program at Pasadena College now and at Point Loma of investing equally in all of the various sports. Many small colleges would kind of pick one sport to be highly competitive in and sort of let the others languish in the shadow of one of the prominent sports that would give them some notoriety. But I think Carol wanted to see a very balanced, well-distributed, funded athletic program across the board, not favoring any particular sport.
And I would add to that, yeah, he was not leader of just NAIA sports. He has been an officer, even president maybe, of the National Coach Association of all colleges of all sizes, the NCAA, one group, everybody. He's nationally known and respected by everybody in this field. But more than that, he's truly a godly person, and he doesn't preach the gospel. He lives the gospel, and everybody around him knows that.
We have one more that we don't really have time to talk about in depth, but I'm just going to mention that when I was a student back in the late 60s and early 70s, there were a group of students that felt like we needed to have a prayer chapel on campus. And so we convinced the administration to let us raise some money and hired an architect. Actually, he donated his services. And while we were raising money for this prayer chapel, Lyle and Grace Prescott were missionaries in the Virgin Islands, and he was swept off some rocks while fishing and died. He was this marvelous pianist and somebody who embodied the character of the school. And we thought, while we were raising money for this new prayer chapel, why not name it after somebody like Lyle Prescott, a missionary, a talented musician, but also a man of character, of Christian character. So that became the Prescott Prayer Chapel. That's all we have time for today. There's so much more to talk about, but we want to thank any of you who have joined us. And Norm, close us off in prayer, would you please?
Our Lord, as we've taken some time to remember these people of significance and influence in the life of Point Loma Nazarene University, it's reminded me that none of us approach this moment in our lives out of a vacuum. but that there are people who have invested in us, who have cared for us, nurtured us, loved us, formed us. Parents, pastors, youth leaders, teachers. And so we just express our thanksgiving and our gratitude for those who have gone before us and who have embodied faithfulness and been people who have realized what it means to be a faithful follower of our Lord. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Go in peace.